In the 1870s, archaeologists excavating an Etruscan tomb in central Italy found bronze cauldrons unlike anything made locally, decorated with griffin heads at the rim, lion handles, extraordinary craftsmanship. The same objects turned up at Olympia in Greece in offerings at temples across the eastern Mediterranean. Nobody knew who made them. Eventually, after decades of archaeology, the origin was traced to a kingdom in the Armenian Highlands that almost nobody has heard of. A kingdom that fought the Assyrian Empire, the most fearsome military machine of the ancient world, to a standstill for over 200 years. A kingdom that built fortresses on volcanic rock so strategically positioned and so massive that the Assyrians, who destroyed everything they touched, could never breach them. A kingdom whose capital's ruins still stand on a cliff above a lake in eastern Turkey with cuneiform inscriptions carved directly into the rock face. Their name was Urartu. To understand what Urartu was, you have to understand what Urartu was up against. The Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BC was the most systematically violent state the ancient world had produced. They didn't just conquer, they documented it. Their kings commissioned detailed annals: how many cities burned, how many people deported, how many heads piled into pyramids outside the gates of defeated cities. And these annals are not exaggerated. The archaeology confirms most of it. The Assyrians had professional armies, iron weapons before most of their neighbors, and a specific strategy: destroy resistance so thoroughly that no one would consider rebelling again. Against this machine, almost no one held out for long. Egypt paid tribute. Babylon was repeatedly sacked. Israel was destroyed and its people deported. The one region that consistently resisted, that consistently survived Assyrian attention, that consistently required new campaigns every generation rather than simply breaking, was the high country around Lake Van in the Armenian Highlands. The Armenian Highlands are not easy country. Lake Van sits at 1,640 meters above sea level, more than a mile high. The landscape is volcanic plateaus, basalt rock outcrops, narrow mountain passes, river valleys that freeze in winter. Winters are severe. Supplies run out. An army fighting at altitude, far from its supply lines, across terrain it doesn't know, against defenders who do know it. That army has a serious problem. The Assyrian military machine was built for open plains and river valleys. Its battering rams and siege towers worked brilliantly against mud brick cities on flat ground, against walls cut from volcanic bedrock on cliffs above a lake. Not so much. Before there was a kingdom here, there were tribal confederations the Assyrians called Nairi and Urartu, groups of highland peoples who had lived in these mountains for centuries and knew every pass, every rock, every winter shortcut. They had been resisting Assyrian raids since before anyone organized them. When someone finally did organize them, the result was Urartu. Around 832 BC, a king named Sargon I built a fortress on a volcanic rock peninsula jutting into the southern shore of Lake Van and called it Tushpa. He called himself King of Kings, a deliberate statement. He built his walls from massive stone blocks, cyclopean masonry without mortar, fitted together so precisely that they have held for nearly 3,000 years. His earliest inscriptions are written in Assyrian, the prestige language of the era, the way a European ruler in the medieval period might use Latin. But something was being built that was not Assyrian. The location was the choice of someone who understood defense. 3 sides of Tushpa were protected by the lake. The 4th side was this volcanic rock face, sheer, enormous, rising from the water. You could not bring siege equipment to bear on it. You could not mine beneath it. It was solid rock. You could not starve it out quickly because Sargon had built water cisterns into the rock itself and planned for siege from the beginning. This was not a palace that happened to have walls. It was a fortress that happened to have a palace inside. Urartian fortress design was not just about defense. It was about permanence. The walls were built from basalt blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted without mortar. Cyclopean masonry. The technique creates walls that move slightly with earthquakes rather than cracking and collapsing. The Urartians were building an earthquake country and they knew it. Every major fortress was positioned on natural high ground, a ridge, a cliff, a volcanic outcrop. Every major fortress had its own water supply. Cisterns carved into the rock, channels cut through stone, calculated to sustain a garrison through a prolonged siege. Every major fortress had granary space. Erebuni's storage rooms held enough wine and grain for years. The Assyrians, when they encountered these fortresses, faced a specific tactical problem. They could not bring their standard siege equipment into the mountains along the approaches. Even if they got there, the walls were not mud brick. They were stone, and the positions were not vulnerable to the mining and ramping techniques that broke Mesopotamian cities. The Assyrian annals describe campaigns against Urartu that end not with, "We took the city," but with, "We burned the fields, we destroyed the orchards, we drove off the cattle." Scorched earth against scorched earth. They couldn't crack the fortresses, so they tried to starve out the population instead. It didn't work either, because the Urartians had thought about that too. Shalmaneser III of Assyria campaigned against the peoples of the Lake Van region from almost the first year of his reign in 858 BC. He records victories. He always records victories. He was an Assyrian king. You didn't write an annal that said, "We tried and failed." But read the annals carefully and a pattern emerges. He campaigns against the same region repeatedly, across decades, generating victory inscriptions each time, and yet the region is never subdued. You don't campaign somewhere 20 times if you conquered it the first time. Shalmaneser builds a stele, a victory monument, at the shores of Lake Van. He does not claim to have taken Tushpa, he claims to have reached it. There is a difference between reaching a fortress and taking it, and Assyrian royal propaganda, precise in its vocabulary, is careful about this distinction. The people of the Armenian Highlands are still there, still organized, still fighting, and getting better at it. The real organizational genius of early Urartu is Menua, who rules from around 800 to 785 BC. Menua doesn't just fight, he builds. He constructs fortresses at strategic points throughout Urartian territory, not just around Tushpa, a network of strong points that means an Assyrian invasion has to fight its way through multiple positions rather than finding a single capital to take. He organizes agriculture at scale. The Urartian Highlands are not naturally fertile, but with terracing and irrigation, they can support a large population. And then there is the canal. Menua orders the construction of a channel to bring water from the Engel River in the mountains east of Van to Tushpa. The distance is approximately 70 kilometers. The canal is cut through rock in places, carried on aqueduct supports in others, a remarkable feat of engineering for 800 BC. The inscriptions mark it throughout the landscape, "This canal Menua built." And here is the extraordinary thing. Parts of Menua's canal still carry water today. The people who live in the Van region still use water from a channel built by an Urartian king nearly 3,000 years ago. Infrastructure outlasts everything else. Argishti I rules from around 785 to 753 BC, and under him Urartu becomes genuinely imperial. He pushes north through the Caucasus into modern Georgia, west into central Anatolia, south toward Syria. At the peak of his expansion, Urartu is larger than the Assyrian Empire. He is also the most meticulous record keeper among Urartian kings. His annals describe every campaign in detail and include something unusual for the ancient world: exact numbers. He records offering 18,765 cattle and 21,174 sheep over his campaigns. He records the precise size of the populations he deports. Tens of thousands of people moved from conquered territories to work the Urartian Highlands. This is the Assyrian model applied by a kingdom that learned from its enemies. Argishti did not just defend Urartu. He turned it into an expansionist power. And in 782 BC, he founded a fortress that would outlast the kingdom by more than 2,000 years. In 782 BC, Argishti founded a fortress on a hill overlooking the Ararat Plain, northwest of Lake Van, in territory he had just conquered. He named it Erebuni. His foundation inscription survives. Argishti, son of Menua, built this great fortress, which he named Erebuni, for the greatness of his country and for the awe of enemy lands. The land was a wasteland. I brought there 6,600 prisoners from the lands of Hatti and Supani. Erebuni was a military headquarters, an administrative center, a warehouse complex, a temple. All inside massive stone walls on a hill that commanded the plain in every direction. It was excavated in the 20th century, and what the archaeologists found was extraordinary. The floor plan of the temple, the throne room, the wine storage. All visible. The wine storage alone could hold tens of thousands of liters. Argishti was planning to garrison troops here for years, and the name Erebuni, over centuries, softened to Irebuni. Irebuni became the name of the settlement that grew around the hill. Irebuni became Yerevan. The modern capital of Armenia, home to over 1 million people, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, is named for a fortress founded in 782 BC. Yerevan is older than Rome. The Armenian Highlands sit at the intersection of major metal trade routes: copper from the Araxes Valley, iron from local sources, and Urartian craftsmen knew what to do with metal. The objects they produced are among the finest of the ancient Iron Age: the bronze cauldrons, large hemispherical vessels, sometimes a meter across, with elaborate griffin head and siren attachments soldered at the rim, lion head handles. The bronze shields, round or figure-8 shaped, decorated with embossed reliefs of lions, bulls, ibexes in procession. The helmets, conical, with detailed narrative reliefs showing military campaigns, hunting scenes, religious ceremonies. The belts, wide bronze bands worn by warriors with intricate animal procession friezes. The Urartian artistic style is immediately recognizable, precise, formal, highly decorative, and they produced these objects not just for themselves. They traded them, gifted them, and sent them across the ancient world. Here is the thing about those bronze cauldrons. They have been found at Olympia, at the great Pan-Hellenic sanctuary in Greece, where they were offered as votive gifts, prestigious objects brought from far away to honor the gods. They have been found in Etruscan tombs in central Italy, where the Etruscan aristocracy prized foreign luxury goods as markers of status. They have been found in Cyprus, in Phrygia, in the Levant. The distribution map of Urartian bronze objects looks like a trade network centered in the Armenian Highlands and radiating across the entire eastern Mediterranean. And these objects didn't just travel, they were copied. Greek craftsmen in the 8th and 7th centuries BC began producing their own versions of griffin head cauldrons, the sphinx and griffin motifs that define archaic Greek decorative art, partly Urartian in origin. The Orientalizing period of Greek art, the dramatic shift in the 8th and 7th centuries when Greek artistic style absorbed Eastern influences, passed directly through Urartian workshops. A kingdom that most people have never heard of helped reshape the visual vocabulary of ancient Greece. In 745 BC, a new Assyrian king comes to power who reorganizes the Assyrian military and administrative system from the ground up. Tiglath-Pileser III is the most effective Assyrian king since Shalmaneser. He modernizes the army, professionalizes the officer corps, reforms the provincial system, and he turns his attention to Urartu. By this point, Urartu is at its height under Sarduri II. Large, powerful, actively competing with Assyria for influence in Syria and the Levant. Tiglath-Pileser campaigns against Sarduri in 743 and again in 735 BC. He wins in the field. Urartian cavalry is broken, Sarduri flees back toward Tushpa. In 735 BC, Tiglath-Pileser pursues to Tushpa itself. He lays siege. And then the Assyrian records do something interesting. They describe Tiglath-Pileser erecting a victory stele on a plain outside the city. Not inside the city. Outside. He carves his image into a rock near the fortress walls. He does not claim to have breached the walls. The stele says he camped before the gates. Sarduri escapes by night into the mountains. Tiglath-Pileser cannot follow. He burned the surrounding country and left. Tushpa still stood. After Tiglath-Pileser's campaigns, Urartu contracts. It loses its western influence in Syria and Anatolia. But the heartland survives. Ruza I, who rules from around 735 to 714 BC, is a capable administrator who spends his reign rebuilding. He expands and improves fortifications, reorganizes the provincial system, and responds to a new threat that neither the Urartians nor the Assyrians had planned for: the Cimmerians. The Cimmerians are horse nomads from the Eurasian steppe, driven south by the Scythians. They appear north of the Caucasus in the early 8th century and begin raiding into Urartian territory from the north. Ruza has to defend against them while simultaneously managing the Assyrian threat from the south. This is a genuinely impossible strategic position, fighting a two-front war where neither front can be ignored and neither can be won quickly. In 714 BC, both threats converge on him at the same time. In 714 BC, Sargon II of Assyria launches what he calls his 8th military campaign. What makes this campaign unique in the ancient world is the surviving document that describes it: a letter from Sargon to the god Ashur, written after the campaign was over, describing every phase of the operation in extraordinary detail. It is one of the longest and most specific military accounts surviving from antiquity. We know the route Sargon took. We know what the landscape looked like. We know where the army camped. We know the names of the local rulers who submitted. We know what Sargon ate. At one point, the letter describes Sargon separated from his main army with only his cavalry, lost in a forest, waiting for his infantry to find him. The kind of detail that military propaganda usually omits. Sargon includes it apparently because even lost in a forest, he was gloriously lost. Sargon's campaign takes an unusual route, not the direct approach toward Tushpa from the west, but a long arc southeast through the Zagros Mountains around the southern end of Lake Urmia into Urartian territory from an unexpected direction. This tells us something. Sargon knew he couldn't take the main Urartian fortresses by direct assault. He was targeting something else. Rusa, already weakened by Sumerian attacks from the north, is caught off balance. His army is defeated in battle near Lake Urmia. Urartian cavalry and infantry are routed. Rusa escapes into the mountains. Sargon cannot pursue him there. The mountains are Urartian terrain, not Assyrian terrain. But Rusa has lost his field army. He cannot prevent Sargon from moving through the countryside. And Sargon now moves towards something very specific, the sacred city of Musasir. Musasir is not a fortress. It is a religious city, the holiest site in the Urartian world, home to the great temple of Haldi, the war god who legitimized every Urartian military campaign. Every Urartian king had dedicated trophies here, shields captured from enemies, bronze statues, cult objects, generations of accumulated sacred treasure, and it was not well defended. It was a temple city, not a military strongpoint, in difficult terrain that Rusa had stripped of troops to fight Sargon elsewhere. Sargon's forces take Musasir essentially unopposed. And then Sargon dictates one of the most detailed inventories of looted goods in ancient history. He lists 34,170 talents of bronze, 6,110 talents of gold and silver, 393,170 bronze objects, 25,212 bronze shields, the golden shield of Argishti I, the greatest Urartian king, with his name inscribed on it, the gold key of Rusa's palace, bronze statues of Urartian gods, including the great statue of Haldi himself. The inventory goes on for hundreds of lines. It reads like a museum acquisition record. It is the most detailed surviving catalog of ancient religious looting. When news of Musasir reached Rusa I, something broke. Sargon's own account says, Rusa heard the news of the sack of Musasir, of the carrying off of Haldi, his lord, and with his own iron dagger he stabbed himself through the heart and put an end to his life. This may be Assyrian propaganda, a convenient story that exaggerates Rusa's humiliation. But Urartian sources from this period are notably absent, and Rusa does disappear from the record around 714 BC. Whether he actually died by suicide or by other causes, the effect was the same. The king was gone, the sacred city was looted, the field army was destroyed, and yet, and this is the crucial point, Tushpa still stood. Erebuni still stood. The major Urartian fortresses were untouched. Sargon never claimed to have taken them because he hadn't. He had damaged Urartu severely. He had humiliated it. He had looted its holiest city. And Urartu survived. Sargon's 8th campaign letter is the most detailed account of any Assyrian campaign against Urartu, and it is also the most revealing about Urartu's specific advantage. In the entire letter, Sargon does not claim to have taken Tushpa. He does not claim to have taken Erebuni. He does not claim to have taken any major Urartian citadel. What he claims to have done is win a battle in the open, devastate the countryside, take the undefended sacred city, humiliate the king. That is not the same as conquering a kingdom. Compare this to Assyrian campaigns elsewhere. When they took Babylon, they took it. When they took Samaria, they took it. The absence of any Assyrian claim to have taken the main Urartian fortresses is significant. The fortresses on the rock, above the lake, in the high country, those held. Against the most powerful military state in the ancient world for more than 200 years, the Urartian fortress system held. After Rusa's death, his son Argishti II inherits what looks like a disaster. A defeated army, a looted capital of religion, a kingdom humiliated in front of the ancient world. He rebuilds. This is a consistent pattern in Urartian history. a severe blow, followed by a recovery that demonstrates how deep the kingdom's structural resilience was. Argishti II rules for roughly 30 years, from 714 to about 680 BC. He reestablishes order, rebuilds relations with neighboring territories, and maintains the fortress system. The Assyrians, meanwhile, have their own problems. Sargon II is killed in battle in 705 BC. His body is not recovered, which is interpreted in Assyria as a terrible omen. His successor, Sennacherib, spends his reign managing crises elsewhere: Babylon, Judah, the Mediterranean coast. Urartu, having survived the worst the Assyrians could throw at it, enters a quieter period. The final flourishing of Urartu comes under Rusa II, who rules from around 680 to 640 BC. He is not expanding territory. The kingdom is smaller than at Argishti's peak, but he builds. His great project is the fortress of Ionis, on a promontory jutting into the northern shore of Lake Van, a commanding position with views across the water to the citadel of Tushpa on the opposite shore. Ionis was excavated beginning in 1989, and the archaeologists found something remarkable. The destruction layer, when the fortress was finally destroyed at the end of the Urartian period, was so sudden and so complete that objects were left exactly where they fell. Bronze helmets, ivory decorations from the throne room, ritual objects from the temple. The excavation felt like opening a time capsule. The last day of Ionis, around 590 BC, frozen in the destruction layer. Rusa II also expands Karmir Blur, a major administrative center near modern Yerevan. Under him, Urartu functions as a coherent, competent state. But the forces gathering on its periphery cannot be stopped by fortress walls. The final pressure on Urartu comes not from Assyria, but from the steppe. The Cimmerians, horse nomads driven south from the Eurasian steppes by the Scythians, had been raiding Urartian territory since the early 700s BC. They are the people who destroy the Phrygian kingdom of King Midas, the famous Golden Touch King, in the 690s BC. The Scythians, another steppe people from the north, follow the Cimmerians south. These nomadic peoples present a different tactical problem than Assyria. Assyria wanted to conquer and administer. The steppe peoples wanted to raid and move on. They hit fast, took what they could carry, and disappeared before a defense could be organized. You cannot garrison against a nomadic people in the same way you garrison against a siege army. Urartu's magnificent fortress system was designed against Assyrian-style warfare. Against Scythian and Cimmerian raiding, it was less effective. The raiders simply avoided the fortresses and burned everything else. In 612 BC, the world that Urartu had been organized around for 200 years ceases to exist. The Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Medes attack Nineveh, the city that had been the capital of the world's dominant empire, the city that organized Assyrian campaigns where the annals were kept, where the kings had carved their victories. Burns. Assyria collapses with a speed that astonishes even its enemies. The Babylonians and Medes divide the Assyrian territories. And the Medes, an Iranian people based in northwestern Iran, begin expanding northwest into Urartian territory. The Urartian kingdom, which had organized itself in opposition to Assyrian pressure, finds that the disappearance of Assyria doesn't save it. It just changes the source of the pressure. The exact end of Urartu is one of the murkier questions in ancient history. There is no Urartian text saying, "and then we were conquered." There is no surviving Median inscription saying, "we took Urartu." What there is, a destruction layer at Karmir Blur, the major Urartian administrative center near modern Yerevan. Burned, weapons abandoned in place, evidence of sudden violent destruction. Similar destruction layers at other Urartian sites. And then silence. No more Urartian royal inscriptions after Rusa III, sometime around 620 BC. The last king of Urartu is a figure we barely know. By around 590 BC, the kingdom that had resisted Shalmaneser, Tiglath-Pileser, and Sargon for over 2 centuries is gone. The Medes are the most likely agents. Their expansion northwest at this time is documented, but it may also have been Scythians, internal collapse, or some combination. Urartu ends not with a final famous battle, but with a silence. The Urartian language, called Hurro-Urartian by linguists, is related to Hurrian, the language of the Mitanni kingdom that preceded Assyria as a Near Eastern power. It is not related to Armenian. This is important because the territory of Urartu is the territory that would become Armenia. But the people who built Urartu and the people who would create Armenia are different populations. The Armenians speak an Indo-European language. They migrated into the Armenian Highlands from the west, probably from Phrygia, sometime in the 7th and 6th centuries BC as Urartu declined. The Urartian language died completely. No one speaks it today. No language family that exists today descended from it. The inscriptions, thousands of them, carved into rock faces throughout the former kingdom in both cuneiform and Urartian hieroglyphic, are readable because Assyrian cuneiform was adapted for them, but the words themselves record a language with no living relatives and no surviving oral tradition. And yet something survived. Not the language, not the religion, not the political institutions, but the landscape was transformed, and the transformation outlasted the civilization. The terraced hillsides that Urartian farmers built still shape the agriculture of the region. Menua's Canal still carries water. And Erebuni, the fortress that Argishti founded in 782 BC, is still there, on a hill on the southeastern edge of modern Yerevan. The city grew up around it. The name drifted. Erebuni became, over centuries of Armenian pronunciation, the root of Yerevan. Armenia celebrates this. The 2800th anniversary of Yerevan was marked in 2018. The Erebuni Museum sits at the base of the hill where the fortress stands. You can walk through the floor plan of Argishti's throne room. You can see where the wine storage was. You can see where the Temple of Haldi stood. The capital of modern Armenia is built on the foundation of a fortress from a civilization that the Armenians themselves are not descended from, but which shaped the land they inherited. And then there is Mount Ararat, the great volcanic mountain on the Armenian-Turkish border, the dominant peak of the entire region, the symbol that appears on the Armenian coat of arms, the mountain associated with Noah's Ark in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible calls it Ararat. The Assyrians called the kingdom Urartu, which in Akkadian became Ararat. The mountain is named, through this chain, for the kingdom. The Armenian coat of arms depicts a mountain that is named for a civilization the Armenians are not genetically descended from. Noah's Ark, in the biblical tradition, lands in the kingdom of Urartu. Sennacherib's sons, in the Bible, flee to the land of Ararat after murdering their father. The historical record confirms this was into Urartian territory, 680 BC. The kingdom left its name stamped onto one of the most recognizable geographical symbols in the world, long after the kingdom itself was gone. Here is the fundamental irony of Urartian history. We know more about Urartu from Assyrian records than from Urartian ones. Urartian royal inscriptions are numerous but formulaic. I conquered X with Haldi's help. I built Fortress Y. I offered Z cattle. They don't give the other side's perspective. The detailed accounts of battles, campaigns, the layout of Urartian cities, the nature of Urartian society. Much of this survives because the Assyrians wrote it down while trying to destroy Urartu. Sargon's letter to Ashur tells us more about the Urartian landscape and military dispositions than any Urartian text. The Assyrian kings who campaigned against Urartu across 2 centuries generated inadvertent ethnographic documentation of the kingdom they couldn't conquer. The irony deepens. Urartu is better preserved in the archives of its enemies than in its own records. We know what Urartu looked like, partly because the Assyrians wanted to remember how hard it was to fight. Urartu appears in the Hebrew Bible, though not by the name Urartu. The Hebrews called it Ararat, consistent with the Akkadian version of the Assyrian name. Genesis. Noah's Ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. This is not a specific peak, but a region, the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey and Armenia. The biblical geography is consistent with the Urartian heartland. 2 Kings and Isaiah both mention Ararat in the context of Sennacherib's assassination in 681 BC. His sons Adramelech and Sharezer murder him, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. Assyrian records confirm this. 2 of Sennacherib's sons fled toward Urartu after the assassination. The Bible is, in this case, confirmed by Assyrian royal inscriptions. Jeremiah mentions Ararat as one of the kingdoms called to make war against Babylon. Urartu was large enough and close enough to Israelite and Judahite awareness that it entered their scripture as a geographic landmark. The far north, the high mountains, the place at the edge of the known world. Why is Urartu so unknown today? The reasons are structural. First, no cultural continuity. The Urartian language died completely. No language family descended from it. No literature transmitted through it. Second, no religious continuity. The worship of Haldi and the Urartian divine triad ended with the kingdom, absorbed into nothing. Third, no dynastic continuity. No later state claimed descent from Urartian kings. Fourth, the wrong geographic position for Greek and Roman writers. By the time Herodotus and the classical authors wrote history, Urartu had been gone for a century, absorbed into the Persian Empire's satrapy of Armenia. They barely mention it. The Armenians who inherited the territory had their own origin traditions and didn't particularly emphasize the pre-Armenian occupants. The result, a kingdom that existed for 270 years, that fought the most powerful empire of the ancient world to a standstill, that built infrastructure still in use today, that shaped Greek art, that gave its name to the world's most famous mountain, essentially vanished from historical consciousness until 19th century archaeology rediscovered it. The rediscovery of Urartu is largely a 20th century story. Russian and Soviet archaeologists excavating in the Yerevan region in the 1930s through 1950s, particularly Boris Piotrowski at Karmir Blur, uncovered substantial Urartian deposits. Piotrowski's work revealed the destruction layer of a major Urartian administrative center, storerooms full of intact pottery, weapons, bronze objects. Turkish archaeologists at Van have worked on the Van Citadel and Kavastepe. And then, in 1989, Turkish archaeologist Altan Silingaroglu begins excavating Ayanis, the fortress Rusa II built on the northern shore of Lake Van. What he finds is extraordinary. The destruction layer is intact, objects still where they fell when the fortress was destroyed. Bronze helmets, ivory plaques, a complete Urartian temple complex with cult objects in place. Ayanis becomes one of the most important Iron Age sites in the Middle East. The Urartu rooms of the Ankara Museum and the Van Museum contain some of the finest ancient bronze work in existence. Almost no one outside of specialist archaeology knows they exist. The physical remains of Urartu are still there. The Van Citadel. Tushpa, the capital, is a rock promontory on the eastern shore of Lake Van with Urartian cuneiform inscriptions carved directly into the cliff face, visible from the road below. The walls, though damaged, are still massive. Near Yerevan, the Erebuni fortress is excavated and open to visitors. You can walk through the floor plan of Argishti's palace, stand in the courtyard of the temple where Haldi was worshipped. In Armenia, this site is a point of national pride. The 800-year-old foundation of the capital city, Savuştepe sits on a ridge near Van with its double citadel still visible, and scattered through the landscape of eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran, rock inscriptions, foundation walls, water channels. The permanent physical record of a kingdom that built to last and, in the material sense, succeeded. The bronze cauldrons deserve a moment to themselves because they represent something unusual in the ancient world, a direct material link between a forgotten civilization and the art of a civilization everyone knows. The Urartian cauldron type. Hemispherical, on a tripod stand, with protom attachments at the rim including griffin heads, bull heads, and siren figures, appears in Urartian workshops from around 800 BC. By 750 BC, identical or derivative objects are being made in Greek workshops, found at Olympia, Delphi, Samos, dedicated to the gods. By 700 BC, Greek craftsmen are making their own versions, subtly different in style but clearly derived from the Urartian prototype. The griffin, now one of the iconic creatures of Western mythology, enters the Greek artistic vocabulary partly through Urartian metalwork. The siren figure, half woman, half bird, luring sailors, appears in Urartian art before it appears in most Greek sources. Urartu didn't just trade its bronzes across the Mediterranean, it exported its iconography. Some of the creatures that populated Greek mythology arrived with Urartian cauldrons. Urartu sits at the center of a modern political question that makes it difficult to discuss objectively. The heartland of Urartu is in eastern Turkey, the Van region, which is also the region most associated with historic Armenian settlement and with the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. Modern Turkey and modern Armenia have complex, sometimes hostile relationships, and Urartu falls in the middle of this. Armenians emphasize their connection to Urartian territory and present Urartu as part of their historical background. Some Turkish scholarship has downplayed this connection. At the same time, the Urartians were not Armenian. They spoke a different language, had a different religion, were ethnically distinct. The honest answer is, Urartu is an important part of the history of the land that became Armenia without being ancestrally Armenian. This is a perfectly normal archaeological and historical conclusion, but it sits uneasily in a political context where historical claims to land are not merely academic. Let's be specific about why Urartian fortresses resisted Assyrian assaults so effectively. The Assyrian siege toolkit in the 9th and 8th centuries BC was formidable, battering rams on wheeled frames, earthen ramps built up against walls, mining under foundations, ladder assault. These techniques worked brilliantly against the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia and the Levant. They required specific conditions: relatively flat approaches, walls that could be mined or rammed, positions that could be surrounded and starved without the garrison having an alternative water supply. Urartian fortresses denied all of these conditions. You could not bring a wheeled battering ram up a mountain road. You could not mine under walls built on solid volcanic rock. You could not cut off water to a garrison with cisterns and channels built into the bedrock. You could not surround a fortress on a peninsula in a lake. The Urartians had built their fortifications specifically to defeat Assyrian siege technique. They had watched the Assyrians operate for generations and built accordingly. In all their inscriptions, the Urartians present themselves in a specific way. Every campaign is launched with Haldi's greatness. Every victory is dedicated to Haldi. The king is Haldi's warrior. His success is divine favor made manifest. This is not unusual for the ancient world, but the Urartian formulas are striking in their consistency. There is also a specific phrase that recurs: "Whoever destroys this inscription, may Haldi and Tesheba and Shivini destroy his name and his seed under the sun." The inscriptions were built to last, carved into rock, not written on clay tablets, and they include curses for their destroyers. Some of these curses are 2,800 years old, and the inscriptions are still standing. The Urartian kings seem to have understood that they were building for permanence, and they built accordingly. The walls, the canals, the inscriptions, all designed to outlast the present. In a material sense, they succeeded beyond anything a Bronze Age king could have imagined. The history of Urartu poses a question that is surprisingly relevant. How does a smaller state survive against a vastly more powerful neighbor? The Urartian answer was terrain, engineering, and depth. Use the terrain to neutralize the enemy's advantages. Build infrastructure so deep into the landscape that destroying it is not possible without occupying the landscape itself. Maintain fortresses not just at the border but throughout the territory so that there is no single point whose fall means the kingdom's fall. This is not a sophisticated political strategy. It's engineering and logistics. But it worked for 200 years against the Assyrians. What finally ended Urartu was not the Assyrians. It was the combination of steppe nomads, the collapse of the enemy that had organized Urartian identity, and the Medes, who were themselves state-level adversaries with their own military innovations. The excavation of Ayanas that began in 1989 deserves its own moment because it demonstrates something rare in archaeology: a perfect destruction layer. When a site is abandoned gradually, objects are taken away. When a site is destroyed suddenly, objects are left where they fall. Ayanas was destroyed suddenly, probably by Scythian or Median attack sometime around 590 BC, and the destruction was complete enough that the excavators found the contents of the fortress essentially as they were on the last day: a bronze helmet in a corner, ivory plaques that had decorated the furniture of the throne room still in the room, cult objects from the temple, storage vessels still in the storeroom. The Ayanas excavation gave archaeologists something extraordinary: not just buildings, but buildings with their contents. Not just what Urartian architecture looked like, but what Urartians put in their rooms. The intimate scale of the evidence. A helmet dropped in a corridor, a ritual object abandoned on an altar, makes the collapse of the kingdom feel immediate in a way that inscriptions never quite do. Long after the kingdom was gone, its iconography survived, embedded in other cultures. The griffin, the lion-eagle hybrid that became a heraldic symbol across medieval Europe, that appears on coats of arms and university emblems and fantasy novel covers, enters Western visual culture partly through Urartian bronze cauldrons that arrived in Greece in the 8th century BC. Greek craftsmen saw the Urartian griffin head cauldron attachments and began making their own. The motif passed into archaic Greek art, then into Hellenistic art, then into Roman art, then into Byzantine art, then into medieval European art. The griffin on a European coat of arms is, through this chain, partly a Urartian creature, the siren, the woman-bird figure that appears in Homer's Odyssey and became one of the defining creatures of Western myth, has Urartian precursors in exactly the form that arrived in early Greece via bronze cauldrons. A kingdom most people have never heard of contributed creatures to the Western imagination that are still instantly recognizable. What survives of Urartu is physical, not in writing. The Urartian language died, its texts readable, but its words belonging to a dead linguistic branch. Not in religion. Haldi is not worshipped anywhere. Not in politics. No dynasty claims Urartian descent. What survives is cut stone and channeled water. The Van Citadel walls are still there, rising from the rock. Erebuni's floor plan is still there, excavated and preserved. The rock inscriptions, thousands of them, are still there, carved into cliff faces with curses for their destroyers, and the destroyers are long gone while the inscriptions remain. And Menwa's Canal, built around 800 BC to carry water 70 kilometers from the mountains to the capital, still carrying water nearly 3,000 years later. The farmers in the Van region who use that water almost certainly don't know who built it. The infrastructure outlasted the knowledge of who built it. That may be the strangest form of immortality in the ancient world. Return to where we started, the Etruscan tomb with the bronze cauldrons. We can now say something about what those cauldrons were and how they got there. Made in workshops in the Armenian Highlands, probably in Tushpa or Erebuni or one of the other Urartian centers, sometime in the 8th or 7th century BC. Traded or gifted to intermediaries, Phrygians, Phoenicians, Greek merchants operating in the eastern Mediterranean, acquired by Etruscan aristocrats who prized foreign luxury goods as status markers and buried with their owners in the tombs of central Italy. The people who made them are forgotten. The kingdom they belong to is unknown to most of the world, and yet the objects traveled 2,000 miles, survived 3,000 years, and are now in museums in Rome and London and New York. Evidence of a civilization that the civilization of Rome and London and New York is partly descended from through Greece without knowing it. Urartu built its walls to outlast everything. It turns out the cauldrons outlasted even the walls.